presentation, Stephen will cover the second half of this adventure from Maine to New York City and back to Georgian Bay. Fran and Stephen have 3 married daughters and 5 grandchildren, and they live in Oakville, weren't they? Not boating or traveling. And Stephen just told me they spend a couple of months in Hawaii every winter. So please give Fran and Stephen a warm Shellbacks welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for that kind introduction, Diane. It's nice to be back here at Shellbacks again with part 2 of our Down East Circle Route adventure. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to dig right in.
Could you be a bit closer to the mic?
Right?
A bit closer to the mic, please. That's possible.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I don't think I do too well bending over the whole time. Is that it, Kyra? So this slide shows you the route we took over the past 2 summers. We keep our boat in Penetanguishene on Georgian Bay. In the summer of 2016, with 2 other boats, we headed down the Trent Severn waterway out to St. Lawrence through the Canadian Maritimes and left the boats in Brooklyn, Maine for the winter. This past summer, we continued the trip down the east coast to New York, up the Hudson, Lake Champlain, the Richelieu River, a bit of the St. Lawrence, up the Ottawa River, down the Rideau Canal, and back up the Trent Severn waterway to Georgian Bay. One of the 3 boats decided to stay in Maine this past summer, so there were just 2 boats cruising together. Fran and I aboard Tug'N, our 37-foot Nordic Tug, and Bob and Jan aboard Wings, a 35-foot Nordhub. We spent about a week getting the boats ready to launch. I installed AIS, replaced zinc anodes, changed impellers, updated chart plotter software, and checked all boat systems. Dense fog and high winds added a few extra days before we could launch, so we kept ourselves busy visiting local attractions, including the village of Brooklyn, the Wooden Boat Building School, and that's also home of the Wooden Boat magazine. Launch was completed with this amazing hydraulic trailer and massive tractor combination that you see there on the top left, which can only be done right at high tide. The place we kept the boat, if they're lucky and fast, they can launch about 5 boats at high tide, and then that's it for the day. So in this presentation, I'll touch on some of the great highlights we experienced. Our blog that we kept contains a whole lot more history on the areas we visited, and for those interested, I'll put the blog address up at the end. Maine is reputedly one of the best cruising grounds in the world. It combines open ocean passages, magnificent rivers, coastal islands, mountains, and even a fjord. The typical cruising season lasts from the 1st of July to Labor Day, offering warm days, cool nights, and prevailing southwest winds. Maine's coast is about 250 miles, but its convoluted coastline and islands measure more than 5,500 miles. There are 6,200 islands, providing enough coastline for a lifetime of cruising. Our timeline for Maine was about 3 weeks. So this slide shows you the route we took in and around Penobscot Bay. Our cruising was all done in the shoulder season here, which gave us extremely variable temperatures, calm wind, strong wind, brilliant sunshine, and dense fog. We had it all, but for the majority of our time here, we had great weather. Tides in Maine are a good 10 feet or more. It's a very scenic shoreline with lots of protected waterways and anchorages. Maine is famous for its grand lighthouses. There are over 60 of them, helping boaters navigate its glacier-carved, craggy coastline, each with a unique light signature. In early times, the isolated job of the light keepers was boring and underpaid work. They had to keep the light burning and sound the fog signal in inclement weather. The only way they got news often was by carrier pigeon. Each lighthouse comes with its own set of stories of ghosts and shipwrecks and more, and one could make a holiday just exploring their lighthouses. Cruising Maine, you see an amazing collection of monster summer homes. Most are immaculately maintained by locals, but owned by people from such places as Boston, Pennsylvania, New York, and other wealthy centers. Most are only used for a few weeks each year. These homes often have elaborate docking mechanisms, many of which have not yet been installed while we were there, as their summer really doesn't begin until July. We took every opportunity to get ashore and explore. At Warren Island State Park, there were convenient $20 a night mooring balls to use. The island was owned by a Philadelphia-based wool merchant and in the late 1800s, and he built his dream home out of spruce logs harvested from the island. Their summers were filled with fishing, sailing, clam bakes, and trips to the mainland, but the highlight was filling their 27-bedroom home with visitors and friends holding their annual masquerade ball. Their island was donated to the state in 1919 after their home was destroyed by fire. Lots of owners of summer homes in Maine own a plane or a jet to make it more convenient to visit. And on one island, we saw this unique sign warning of low-flying aircraft, which caught our attention. One of the most enduring symbols of Maine and Penobscot Bay in particular are the schooners or windjammers. Once upon a time, thousands of wooden sailing ships raced up and down the eastern seaboard in hopes of being the first to market with their cargo of fish, granite, lumber, and other supplies. Now the remaining small fleet of schooners carry people who wish to experience the wonderful feel of sailing on these fast and graceful vessels. You can go out for as short as a couple of hours or up to a one-week excursion. Local communities have schooner days events each year to celebrate their maritime history. There are also annual schooner races that, as a guest, you can participate in. 20 years ago, Fran and I spent 6 days on this schooner Heritage, which sails out of Rockland, Maine. This past summer, we managed to visit her again, and we thoroughly enjoyed walking her deck once more. She's now 35 years old, but as you can see, she's in pristine condition. Castine, Maine, is one of the oldest towns in New England, predating Plymouth by about 7 years. It's home to the Maine Maritime Academy, which trains merchant seamen. We took a mooring ball from Penny Eaton's boatyard on the Bagonish River. The river's normal current is 2 knots, and when that's mixed with an incoming or outgoing 11-foot tide, can make it challenging to pick up a mooring ball. When the tide, the river current, and the wind are opposing one another, you can trund your boat at some odd angles to the conditions. We thoroughly enjoyed wandering around town and seeing its unique architecture, great mix of restaurants, and soaking up its maritime history. Camden was probably our favorite stop in Maine. First settled in 1771, Camden is a beautiful town with an immense maritime history of boat building, sawmills, as well as grist mills and carriage building factories. In the late 1800s, Camden's natural beauty was discovered by sportsmen and those seeking summer homes or those nostalgic for the sea. Local properties got snapped up by the wealthy folk from away. Today, Camden's a magnet for boaters and tourists with its lovely old town charm, its schooner fleet, and its enormous mooring field. Can anyone tell me anything about this picture?
Handy wrench.
Okay, so a boating friend of ours was monitoring our position every day on the AIS, and he noticed one day we were in Camden and our boat was extremely close to another boat named Gizmo, owned by Ben Ellison. Ben is a rather famous reviewer and writer on marine electronics for Passage Maker magazine, Sail magazine, and Power and Motor Yacht magazine. So I went off to introduce myself to Ben and let him know how much I and my Great Lakes boating friends enjoy his writing and his Penbow website and blog. Maine's substantial tides have most marinas and yacht clubs using mooring balls instead of docks. They are a cost-effective way of dealing with the tides, so that's quite understandable. However, elsewhere, in our humble opinion, mooring balls are becoming an out-of-control problem in Maine. Many popular anchorages are filled with private mooring balls, and a number of times we found ourselves hard-pressed to find a location to anchor. Many boaters don't hesitate to pick up a private mooring ball if it's not being used. When we entered an unfamiliar anchorage, which basically means all of them, we try and ask another boater for input, and more than once we were warned about certain mooring balls that haven't been maintained or shouldn't be considered safe. The salt water, of course, will corrode the mooring ball, chain, and shackles. But we found the extent of private mooring balls very frustrating and concluded the state has lost control over waters. Hopefully that doesn't happen here in Ontario. So this is our route from Camden on Penobscot Bay out to Booth Bay Harbor. Booth Bay was our first stop after exploring the relatively calm waters of Penobscot Bay. As you cruise further south down the coast of Maine, weather forecasts become much more important as you're out in open ocean conditions. When the wind is from the northeast, east, or southeast, you're pretty much guaranteed to have fog as well as more significant ocean swells and wind waves. Booth Bay Harbor's economy is driven by tourism. As crowds arrive to go out on boat tours to coastal islands, on whale watching outings, or to enjoy the town's boutiques and restaurants. Large crowds also arrive for special events such as schooner days, when the Penobscot Bay fleet of schooners arrives and descends on the harbor. As forecast, we got heavy fog and strong winds that kept us in Booth Bay for 5 days. Thankfully, there was lots to do and explore, including an antique car show, great seafood restaurants, shopping, and more. So this is our route from Booth Bay Harbor to York Harbor. Our first stop was Portland, Maine. Portland is Maine's largest city with a population of about 67,000. The greater Portland area has a little over 500,000 people, or 1/3 of Maine's population. The area was first settled in 1632 as a fishing and trading village named Casco. The community was destroyed multiple times in various conflicts and renamed Falmouth, then the Neck, and then Portland. In 1920, when Maine became a state, Portland was its capital. In 1853, upon completion of the Grand Trunk Railroad to Montreal, Portland became the primary ice-free harbor for Canadian exports, and in the process became a significant railway hub and shipping port. Following nationalization of the Grand Trunk Railway in 1923, Canadian export traffic was redirected from Portland to Halifax, causing a significant decline in the Portland economy. Portland's old port went through a major transformation in the 1970s when developers bought up derelict buildings and refurbished them into apartments, condos, and retail space. Early on, the Old Port Association was formed, and they helped halt demolition of the historic buildings. The end result is a wonderful district with cobblestone streets, renovated 19th century buildings, restaurants, boutiques, and offices. It's a magnet for tourists, marinas, yacht clubs, as well as commercial vessels and lobster boats. Biddeford Pool was another great stop along Maine's coastline. It's a very pretty location with lovely homes around its perimeter and a large beach on the North Shore. This was the first location on our trip last summer, June 22nd, where it felt like the local boating season was well underway. The Biddeford Yacht Club had all their boats in the water, and lots of boats were out for a day sail. We had a great shore walk among the well-maintained summer homes on Wood Island, and did a little beach combing at low tide while local kids had a quick swim in the very chilly water. A number of the communities we stayed at were on rivers flowing out into the Atlantic. River current, tidal water, and wind often create challenges mooring in these locations. The top left photo is in York Harbor, and we had an extra high tide while we were there. The incoming tidal current was 4.5 knots. It actually got our propeller spinning, which is not good for a driftless shaft seal, because there's no lubricating water coming from the transmission cooler. It took me multiple tries to get a small line around the shaft coupler and tie it off to an engine mount to stop the shaft from spinning. And at times the mooring ball was a couple of feet underwater, which was quite unnerving. At Newburyport, we were planning on taking a mooring ball, but when we saw the strength of the current there, we felt it would have been dangerous to try and launch our dinghy to go ashore, so we took a dock, all of which were parallel to the river current and fairly easy to maneuver up to. Entering these waters these rivers when the tidal current is strong, or when the river current at the mouth is opposing the wind, the water conditions can be quite confused and even treacherous. And when these conditions are coupled with high volumes of weekend boat traffic, you have a recipe for a significant challenge or even a disaster, as the photo on the bottom right shows. So this is our route from York Harbor to Newport, Rhode Island. First settled in the 1600s, Manchester by the Sea enjoyed over 200 years as an active fishing community. However, starting in 1845, Manchester became the summer colony of choice for Boston society. Its stately mansions line the shore, providing great eye candy for visiting boaters. The Manchester Yacht Club surprised us by providing free mooring and yacht tender service to the town dock. The dredged harbor had a very large mooring field and a very active boating community. We were surprised how shallow the water was at low tide close to shore. We think our boat gently rested in the muddy bottom briefly at low tide, and thankfully we had calm waters. Manchester by the Sea is the name of an Oscar-winning movie from 2017, and our yacht tender driver was quick to point out that the movie does not present the town in a very good light. And in fact, most of the film was not done in Manchester. And indeed, we found he was correct. The town was quaint, picturesque, and fun to explore. Well worth a visit by boat or car. Our next destination was a brief lunch stop at that boating mecca called Marblehead, Massachusetts, known as the yachting capital of America. It's a mooring-only harbor with a mooring ball wait list of over 15 years. The harbor has only one town dock with limited space to load or unload your boat. Historically, it was a fishing harbor, and today has a small fleet of fishing boats, but now more than ever, it's a key layover port for cruising and racing yachts from the world's most serious yachting circles. The famous Marblehead to Halifax race alternates, with the race starting in Marblehead on even-numbered years. It was a Monday, and we called ahead asking the harbor master if we might tie up at that one town dock for a couple of hours to have lunch and a quick walk about town. They were wonderfully accommodating, pointing us to Maggie's Sail Loft for lunch, and it turned out to be a terrific restaurant pub frequented by locals with a great menu and atmosphere. After lunch, we strolled about enjoying the town's historic New England architecture and visiting an art gallery. We were running an art class before departing to the town of Scituate, Massachusetts, our jumping off point for transiting the Cape Cod Canal. The Cape Cod Canal is man-made through the southwest corner of Cape Cod Peninsula, connecting Cape Cod Bay to the north with Buzzards Bay to the south. The 7-mile-long canal accommodates 14,000 boats per year, shaving 137 miles off a journey along the coast. It can accommodate vessels up to 825 feet long, 135 feet high, and a draft of up to 32 feet. The tide on the Cape Cod Bay side is about 9 feet and 4 feet on the Buzzards Bay side. So this difference creates some swift-moving currents that reach up to 5.2 knots and change direction every 6 hours. Apparently, the canal is also used by the occasional whale or dolphin. The idea of a canal was first considered in 1623 by the Pilgrims, who scouted out various routes but went no further. In 1717, the Jeremiah Gutter Canal was created some distance to the east, across a narrower portion of the Cape, and it remained active until the late 1800s. It took several tries to build a canal in its present location, finally opening in 1916 as a privately owned toll canal. It was only 30 feet wide and 25 feet deep. It was hard to navigate, causing numerous accidents which quickly tarnished its reputation. On July 21st, 1918, a German U-boat surfaced and sank a tug in 4 barges near the canal, after which the U.S. government took over its operation. They operated and maintained the canal until 1920, and then bought it in 1928 to operate as a free waterway. Between 1935 and 1940, the government widened the canal to its current 480 feet and dredged it to 32 feet. To transit the canal comfortably, using our cruising guide, we followed its recommendation of entering the canal at slack water and taking advantage of the current that would begin to flow from east to west shortly afterwards. Tide times and current information were all laid out nicely in our Tides Near Me app on the phone, and our transit time worked out perfectly. Shortly after entering the canal, a favorable current of about 3.5 knots sped us along through this magnificent waterway. Our next destination was Cuttyhunk, Massachusetts, one of the Elizabeth Islands that extend about 14 miles off the southwest end of Cape Cod. They are all of varying size and all are owned privately by the Forbes family, except for Cutty Hump, the most westerly of the Elizabeth Islands. We got there in time for brunch at the famed Cutty Hump Fishing Club. It was founded in 1894 and wasn't open to the public until 1998. It's a rustic club with furnishings, fittings, and an ancient library. Pretty much is just what it was like when President Roosevelt made a trek here for fishing in the early 1900s. Lunch on the club veranda was great and the views were spectacular. Cutty Hunt's an extremely popular boating destination for boaters from Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Just as we finished up breakfast, we spotted our friend's boat arriving from Rhode Island and made our way back to the harbor to join them and then embark on a walking tour of the island to soak up its incredible views. The next day, our friends from Rhode Island led the way from Cutty Hump to Newport. You could tell we were getting close to this other East Coast boating mecca as we were passing more and more yachts, well over 100 feet long. As we approached the shoreline of Rhode Island, we began to see one mansion after another. The display of wealth was like nothing we'd ever seen before. Then, entering Narragansett Bay, turned the corner and we entered Newport. And our hearts skipped a beat when we saw this harbor. The harbor was massive and filled with an enormous collection of mega yachts. Katie Krogan were celebrating their 40th anniversary with a rendezvous at Newport, right next to where we were moored. Our friends from Rhode Island drove us all around the Newport area, and here are a few of the more of the homes that we saw. Newport was originally settled in 1639. It grew rapidly in the 17th and 18th centuries, spurred on by Portuguese Jews who fled persecution in Portugal. They brought capital, business skills, trading contacts, and knowledge, which helped Newport become a wealthy trading center. Rhode Island also became the most active port in all of the United States in the slave trade, with 60% of slave trading sailings launched from this tiny island. Many laws were being broken by this activity, and a number of Rhode Island families made substantial fortunes in the trade. Many local merchants bought shares in these illegal voyages. Today, Newport is a major tourist and boating center with every conceivable boating service and expertise available. The downtown is filled with a wonderful array of restaurants, boutiques, and companies catering to the boating community. So here's our route from Narragansett Bay to New York and the start of the Hudson River. As you can see, leaving the Newport area, we are out in the open ocean to get to Block Island and again over to Long Island. And after that, we're protected by the waters of Long Island, in the waters of Long Island Sound. So this is an aerial picture of Block Island, and you can see the enormous pool in its center, which houses several marinas and a huge mooring field. Block Island is another favorite destination for local boaters. The island was named after Dutch explorer Adrian Block. It has a population of just over 1,000, and 40% of its 9,700 square miles is set aside for conservation. Block Island is a summer tourist destination offering sailing, hiking, cycling, fishing, and beaches. We arrived here July 3rd, and the place was packed. In this slide, you can see we're in the mooring field, and all those dots on the radar screen are boats. In the afternoon, the wind was blowing a good 20 knots through the harbor, but every boat was well anchored and orderly. There had to be over 400 boats here. In the evening, the winds calmed down, and it was just magical with many boats lit up with colored lights, neon lights, flashing lights, Christmas lights, and more, all to celebrate their 4th of July holiday. The next day, we headed across the open water to the eastern end of Long Island, to Cockles Harbor on Shelter Island, in lovely dead calm water. It was a great cruise, however, its peacefulness was marred in the last half hour as we listened to a distress call on Channel 16. The tidal currents around Plum Island are treacherous. The couple had anchored on the east side of Plum Island, and the husband had gone for a swim. He got separated from the boat and couldn't swim back against the current. When his wife called the Coast Guard on the radio, the husband was trying to swim to Plum Island. His wife did not know how to operate the boat, nor did she know how to raise the anchor. During the 20-minute radio exchange, until Towboat USA got to the scene, his wife got more and more frantic as she watched her husband disappear from view. Towboat USA reported they found her husband, and the Coast Guard then asked the wife for her cell phone number. That was the end of the very tense radio exchange. Only the next day, doing the Google query, did we learn the 63-year-old man drowned trying to swim ashore. We were drained and devastated listening to the radio exchange, and it prompted us to review and adjust our own safety procedures. Cockles Harbor was an absolutely lovely anchorage, complete with a perfect sunset. Our cruise down Long Island Sound was terrific. The water was protected in the ocean by Long Island. The boat traffic was light, and the communities and secure anchorages along the shoreline were nicely spread out. While there were numerous mooring balls in each harbor, we chose to anchor and use our dinghy for shore excursions. Our final stop on Long Island was Port Washington. It's a popular stop for vessels wanting to transit New York City via the East River. It's a lovely stop with great waterfront homes and mansions and an enormous mooring field. Most services anyone would need are located right near the harbor. While there, we had the threat of severe thunderstorms, but in the end got out lightly with just heavy rain. This is our route from Port Washington through the East River and the beginning of our trip up the Hudson. Both ends of the East River are tidal, but on different schedules. So for a comfortable transit, one has to time your arrival carefully. At the wrong time, the Hellgate section of the East River will have currents exceeding 5 knots. We follow the cruising guide instructions to the letter, arriving at Throngs Neck Bridge at the east end of the East River, near the end of the ebb tide. So the first 7 miles, we had a light ebb current against us, and this meant we'd arrive at Hellgate right at slack tide. It all worked perfectly. The river and the tidal currents were just as we expected, and made it a comfortable ride. Passing through the East River and New York City was quite a thrilling day. We passed under 9 major bridges, which were all extremely impressive. I focused on the boat traffic using our radar and AIS, doing my best to stick to the rules of the road, while Fran sat on the bow with our camera, trying to capture as many pictures of the sights as she could. The activity around us was amazing. The boat traffic was immense, with tugs pushing barges, tour boats, New York City police boats, fire boats, go-fast boats, sailboats, mega yachts, sea-doos, LaGuardia Airport, fantastic high-rise architecture, helipads and helicopters, Statue of Liberty, and more. Finally, starting up the Hudson River, the bottom right photo on this slide shows the beginning of the scenic part of the river. It's big and wide and it's tidal all the way up to Albany. Surprisingly, we found very little boat traffic on our trip up the Hudson. But there was always something interesting to see on the river. This Bannerman Castle was built by an eccentric Scot named Francis Bannerman, who was a dealer in military surplus. He bought this island on the Hudson and built a castle and other structures around 1900 to stow his growing arsenal of munitions and surplus military equipment. Business shrank early in the 20th century due to increased government regulations and restrictions. Francis Bannerman died in 1918, and this castle was partially destroyed in 1920 when 200 tons of shells and gunpowder exploded in an ancillary building. The property lay vacant for many years, finally being purchased by the state of New York in 1967. The military equipment was removed, and briefly tours of the island were offered. Fire, vandalism, and neglect left the castle in ruins, but it certainly provided an interesting backdrop for our anchorage that afternoon and evening on a glorious summer day. On our way up the Hudson, we had the constant company of trains. On the west shore, there were freight trains that ran day and night. They were exceptionally long, and when we took the time to count one, it had 138 cars and 3 engines. On the east side, there were commuter trains running frequently during the day, but of course stopped overnight. Blasts of train engine horns were never present. Kingston, New York was an interesting stop for us. In addition to a great collection of restaurants, we found a well-preserved downtown area and a small but fascinating museum of the Hudson River. There's a wooden boat school where a group of volunteers were busy refurbishing the Woody Guthrie, a Hudson River sloop day sailor, originally launched in 1978 to offer the public free access to the Hudson River. The Museum of the Hudson also had loads of information about the geology of the river valley and the impact of the Ice Age, a history of the original native inhabitants of the river valley and how they used it as a resource for their day-to-day lives. For more modern history, there were great photos and write-ups on the glorious days of paddle wheel ships that took wealthy folk on river cruises. The vessels had huge ballrooms, dining rooms, and luxury accommodation, each ship trying to outdo the competition in its offering. Poughkeepsie was the site of iceboat regattas for many years, where the world's best and fastest came to compete. There was a wonderful video of interviews with older local folk who recalled the days of racing along the frozen river, trying to keep up with or even pass the commuter trains that could reach speeds of 70 miles an hour. There was also great information and pictures of all the Hudson River lighthouses and many women lighthouse keepers. It was truly a delightful museum to explore. I really enjoyed seeing all the different tugs on the river. They came in all shapes, colors, and sizes, and were clearly a staple fixture on the Hudson. Anyone tell me anything about this slide?
That's Pete Seeger.
Pete Seeger, right. Clearwater is a charitable foundation started by the legendary musician, singer, songwriter, activist, environmentalist, and peace advocate, Pete Seeger, and his wife, Tashi. In 1966, in despair over the pollution of his beloved Hudson River, Seeger announced his plans to build a boat to save the river. At the time, the Hudson River was ranked with raw sewage, toxic chemicals, oil pollution, and devoid of fish. Seeger, along with other concerned individuals, believed a majestic replica of the sloops that sailed the Hudson in the 18th and 19th centuries would bring people to the river where they could experience its beauty and be moved to preserve it. Inspired by that vision, the organization began the construction and launch of the sloop Clearwater in 1969, a majestic 106-foot-long replica vessel. The Clearwater and the annual Clearwater Music Festival worked hard to draw attention to the problem of pollution on the Hudson, which caused a range of harmful effects on wildlife and people who lived along the river. Clearwater gained national recognition for its activism, which forced a cleanup of the PCB contamination, addressing pesticide runoff, sewage disposal, and much more. Clearwater played a big role in the Environmental Protection Agency's decision to compel the Hudson River's biggest polluters to remove their toxic waste. Pete Seeger was named a Clearwater hero for his prominent efforts in the passage of the Clean Water Act, which has turned out to be one of the most effective environmental laws in the United States. In 2014, after Pete Seeger's death, the EPA cited Seeger's incredible work and his extraordinary leadership, all of which helped make the Hudson River cleaner. He was a great man of our time. In Troy, New York, just north of Albany, is the first lock on the Hudson River. It's a controlling lock that prevents tides from going further north on the Hudson. Just north of Troy is Waterford, New York. And here boaters make a decision. Either turn left and head west to enter the Erie Canal and make your way to Lake Ontario or places further west like the Finger Lakes or even Lake Erie, or continue north through the Champlain Canal to Lake Champlain and further north to the Richelieu River and the St. Lawrence River. Most boaters make a point of stopping in Waterford for at least a day. A stop is even more enticing with free docking, hydro, water, washrooms and showers, nearby grocery stores, good restaurants, and great places to hike. We met numerous interesting boaters and their boats in Waterford. In our case, we continued to head north on the Champlain Canal and its 55 nautical mile route from the Hudson River to Lake Champlain. Technically, the first 31 miles is a navigable section of the Hudson River, followed by approximately 24 miles of man-made canals containing 11 locks. All of this makes up what is known as the Champlain Canal. There is some commercial traffic on the river, mostly barges being pushed by hefty tugs. The Champlain Canal was very picturesque and interesting. The route was used by Native Americans for thousands of years before European colonization. There were ruins of abandoned forts from the 1700s, sites where remnants of the original Champlain Canal were built from 1817 to 1823, including a 23-lock system with a limiting depth of 5 feet and an overhead limit of 11 feet. Canal boats back then were 70 to 80 feet long and carried up to 150 tons of cargo. The boats were pulled along by mules or horses on a path alongside the canal. Today the locks are much larger, but flooding does occur as the waterway captures runoff from an enormous watershed area. The Champlain Canal had been closed 4 days the week before we transited it. Arriving at Lake Champlain was a real treat. The water was free of silt, providing a lovely invitation for swimming in its fresh, clear water. We spent 10 days exploring and enjoying Lake Champlain. It offers beautiful cruising for both sailors and powerboaters. We anchored out every night we were on the lake. Lake Champlain is bordered by New York on its west shore, Vermont on much of its east shore, and Quebec on a little bit of its northern shore. Interestingly, Quebecers dominate the boating scene on Lake Champlain, with many of them having their home marinas in New York or Vermont-based locations. Both sides of the lake have wonderful mountainous profiles, providing a great backdrop for sunrises and sunsets. For most of our stay, we had beautiful weather. Dead calm wind, and only near the end did we see how quickly waves could build up when the winds funnel either north or south on this long, narrow lake. The next leg of our journey took us to the top of Lake Champlain, through Canada Customs and Immigration just north of Rouse's Point, and on down the 9-mile Chambly Canal, which bypasses the rapids in the initial part of the Richelieu River. The Chambly Canal runs from Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu to the town of Chambly. The canal was built between 1831 and 1843. It has 9 locks, and while there has been some automation applied, the locks look pretty much the same today as they did when first built. The lock dimensions are 110 by 21 feet, which is quite a bit smaller than, say, the locks in the Trent Severn or Rideau Canal. Some sections of the canal are so narrow that only one-way traffic is allowed. In the top left photo, you can see the canal we are transiting and the Richelieu River down below us, littered with rapids. This area was coveted by both the French and British colonial powers in the 17th and 18th centuries. Because of the river's strategic position, numerous military fortifications were erected along its shoreline. The river was the scene of several conflicts between the end of the 17th century and the early 19th century, including between the French and the Iroquois, the French and the English, and between the English and the Americans. In the 19th century, the Richelieu River became an important economic pathway instead of a warpath. The construction of the Chambly Canal was completed in 1843, allowing easier transportation of products between Canada and the U.S. Today, pleasure craft and tourism contribute to the regional prosperity of this heritage corridor. We really enjoyed exploring the communities along this waterway. Chambly was a delightful town to visit. It's also home to a beautifully restored French fortification named Fort Chambly. It's a National Historic Site run by Parks Canada. We toured the fort, had lengthy walks about town and its parks, and sampled several terrific restaurants, and also enjoyed our happy hours under the shade of the trees by the boats. The Richelieu River is another lovely leg of the trip. The river is easily navigated with a comfortable 1-knot current pushing you along, great shoreline scenery and communities. You enter the river after completing a flight of 3 locks right at Chambly, the left photo that you see there. Then there's just one more lock to transit on the river before the Richelieu takes you to the St. Lawrence River. The lock here is enormous, with a long dock inside the lock and lock staff to help you tie up to the dock as you transit. The St. Oars Lock was a beautiful setting. It had a lovely park, lots of docking for visiting boats, a fish ladder to help migrating fish navigate the dam on the site. Parks Canada has installed 5 of these tentix that can be rented. They're a cross between a tent and a rustic cabin. Each comes with 3 beds to accommodate up to 6 people, as well as a fire pit and a sheltered area for cooking and eating. There were many lovely homes along the river that got bigger and bigger the closer we got to Montreal. Entering the St. Lawrence is always exciting and guaranteed to get your adrenaline flowing. Its immense size, the strength of its current, and its many ocean-going ships does it for me every time. Just west of Sorel on the north shore of the St. Lawrence, we went through a narrow channel next to Ile aux Cochons and anchored in a protected spot where you could enjoy watching the ships passing without feeling any of the weight. All of the anchored boats stayed in a tight formation thanks to the 1.5 to 2 knot current in the river. The lower left photo on the slide shows our companion boat wings in this anchorage and the ship traffic out beyond it. So this is our route from Sorel on the St. Lawrence to Montreal and then up the Ottawa River. Heading upstream on the St. Lawrence, especially last year with the high water level in Lake Ontario and the extraordinary volume of water flowing through the St. Lawrence, the current was stronger than normal. We followed the recommendation of a local boater and took the small craft channel from Sorel to our next anchorage at the Boucherville Islands near Montreal. This route proved to be very relaxing as we didn't have to worry about ship traffic, and it saved us about a half a knot of current from the 2 to 2.5 knots in the main channel in the river. Shortly after arriving at our anchorage, we got whacked by a severe thunderstorm, followed by a magnificent sunset. The next day it was a short transit to Montreal, but an interesting one. The current was strong, so we tended to hug the shoreline to reduce its impact. On the last stretch before arriving at the Montreal Yacht Club, we were in a current of about 6 knots. So we had a lot of throttle to get into the entrance of the club, followed by a dead slow idle as you entered the club basin, which was free of current. Montreal, of course, was lovely, but this was our second visit by boat, and we covered the city and its history in more detail in last year's presentation to your club. This year we did stay at the Montreal Yacht Club, and its facilities were first class. It's located a very short walk from Old Montreal and all its attractions. To begin our cruise up the Ottawa River, we departed the Montreal Yacht Club, briefly heading downstream in the 6-knot current, followed by an almost 180-degree turn to head upbound through 2 seaway locks, and then depart the seaway and head across Lac St. Louis to St. Anne de Bellevue. The ships you see in these photos, of course, have priority, so we had several hours to wait to get through the seaway locks. St. Anne de Bellevue is a great town on the westernmost point of Montreal Island. It's the second oldest settlement on the island, established in 1703 in the strategic juncture of the Ottawa and St. Lawrence rivers. When the St. Anne Canal was completed in 1843, it greatly increased the number of travelers to the town. Same thing happened in 1854 when the Grand Trunk Railway was built through the town, and again when the CP rail line was completed in 1887. In 2002, St. Anne de Bellevue was merged with the city of Montreal. St. Anne is a very popular stop for boaters, and as you can see in the lower left photo, they were still struggling with high water in early August. In the spring, the lock at St. Anne was completely underwater, as was the main street of town, some 8 feet above the water level that you see in this picture. So in comparison, Lake Ontario communities actually got off quite a bit lighter. Cruising up the Ottawa River was very scenic and interesting. The Carillion Lock was particularly unique. The Ottawa River's rapids were originally made navigable by construction of the Grenville Canal under the direction of Captain Henry Burnett from the Royal Corps of Engineering in England. Between 1833 and 1843, the 5.9-mile-long canal and its 11 locks were completed, with the hard labor of hundreds of Irish immigrants and French Canadians. The canal and its locks were designed for military needs, but the locks were too small for commercial use.